the UT Campus Group, the UT Men's Issues Awareness Society, or UTMIAS. The first thing I'd like to point out for all of you attending here today is that cameras are present at the event, and also that the UT disruption of events policy is in effect. In the event of a disruption, I'll just remind you of the steps to follow in case of disruption. Step 1, we'll identify the disruptive persons and request that he or she desist. Step 2, we'll inform the obstructors of the existence of the policy and the university's intent to protect free speech. Step 3, if the disruption continues, those responsible should be asked to leave. Step 4, if the disruption still continues, then we will recess the event and consider options to reconvene in an alternate space. Step 5, we'll take measures to ensure the event can be reconvened without obstruction. And in step 6, if all these interim measures are not sufficient, we will consider the assistance of the external authorities. Okay, so you are invited to follow us online tonight. Please tweet your questions and comments using @UofT and hashtag Let's Talk Men or UofT. We try to host an event each month on campus, and I would invite you to sign up for emailed event notifications with me at the end of the talk or at reception just outside the front doors, and to receive a schedule of our activities for this semester. Our goal at the UTMIAS is exploring gender equality, identity, and responsibility in society, particularly areas of gender that are understudied in our culture. That leads us to a current focus on the status, health, and well-being of boys and men, where attention, investment, and support for dedicated educational and social resources stands currently at a level that is far from ideal. The UTMIAS has the objective to explore the seriousness of this issue and to see what consequences may or may not arise for our society. Tonight's talk is how the press miscovers gender and what to do about it. Our talk is being sponsored by the Canadian Association for Equality, a charitable organization with a goal to provide up-to-date evidence-based research, education, and information through inclusive conversation, intersexual dialogue, and a comprehensive discussion of the facts. No ideology or special interest agendas are promoted. One of the Canadian Association for Equality's most recent projects is establishing the first Canadian Centre for Men and Families in Toronto. Their director is Justin Trottier, who I will now bring up here to tell you a little bit more about this exciting new project, and also briefly about the Canadian Association for Equality, our sponsor tonight.
Thanks, Denise. Which do I speak into?
The bigger.
There was some issues with the sound quality. I'm wondering if we could improve that, or is it a function of how close I should be speaking? Mark?
Just speak farther away.
Okay. Well, we'll try that. If there are issues, we may need to try to address them. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. It's nice to see all of you. I think there's quite a few new faces today, so welcome especially to those for whom this is your first event. As Denise said, I'm with the Center for Men and Families. We're a new social service and mental health facility that has opened not too far from here in downtown Toronto at Carleton and Jarvis. So just very briefly, in terms of some of the programs that we're offering, we're now doing a variety of social services really geared at male clientele, things like a peer support group for fathers, one-on-one counseling. We offer mindfulness meditation and a number of discussion groups oriented around gender issues, masculinity, things like that. We've also, since launching a billboard campaign focused on violence against men, which you may have seen a copy of the poster with the same image outside, or here it is, I'm holding it up. Since we've put this up announcing that half of domestic violence victims are men, and yet there are no shelters dedicated to us, we've also been acting as a referral agency to dozens and dozens of men who have contacted us looking for safe places that they can go to flee from abusive situations. So we're very, I guess happy is the wrong word, but we're at least satisfied that we can play that particular role. So we're doing some important work. We're always, of course, looking for volunteers at the center. So you can find out more about our programs at our website, which is menandfamilies.org, menandfamilies.org. And you can contact us at the website, or you can talk to me today if you want to find out about volunteering opportunities there. I'll also remind you that out behind the doors there's a sign-up sheet. If you want to get email notices about upcoming events, we will have some exciting ones in the next couple of months that we're sponsoring with UTMIA, in particular looking at Aboriginal violence. We're going to have a speaker named Jen Mount Pleasant, who's done research looking at murdered and missing Aboriginal men and women. So she's going to share some of her findings. That's in a couple of months. We have a speaker next month who's just authored a book looking at power as it relates to gender issues. So that should be provocative as well. So you'll get notices about that. There's no charge, no obligation. It's just an email list. That's about it. And I think with that, I will turn things back to Denise. Thank you.
Okay, is this okay? Like this? Okay. Okay, thank you, Justin. Tonight, the U of T Men's Issues Awareness Society is pleased to present our monthly public talk. And tonight's talk is how the press...
Push the mic back, away from her mouth.
Oh, is this...
That's good.
You're supposed not to hear you far enough so you don't...
how the press miscovers gender and what to do about it. So you may have heard about terms being used in the media like campus rape culture, misogynist men's rights associations, the war on women, phrases and words that perhaps can often be unnerving and alarming in tone. These words invite us very much to pay great attention to how the media addresses discussions on gender issues. We may already have a sense of just how grave or immediate an impact the media can have on our view and perspectives of gender. And Robyn Urback is our speaker tonight. She is a journalist and columnist with the National Post. Robyn will discuss how gender, both women's issues and men's issues, are portrayed in the Canadian media, why they are portrayed in the way that they are, and how we might go about gaining a more balanced and comprehensive media coverage on gender. Robyn Urback writes about culture, religion, diversity, multiculturalism, feminism, and gender issues. She has covered contentious topics like rape culture and the riots against so-called men's rights events at the University of Toronto and elsewhere. So just a reminder that after tonight's talk, we'll have a discussion when we'll be able to take your questions or comments. But please refrain from commenting or asking questions until the end of Robyn's talk. So we're very excited to have Robyn speak here tonight. It's going to be an awesome talk. Please join me in welcoming Robyn to the University of Toronto and to the U of T Men's Issues Awareness Society's monthly public lecture series.
Probably the most contentious part of my talk today will be how close I get to the microphone. So, is the sound okay?
Yeah,
we can.
Okay, good? Okay, perfect. Thank you for that introduction. You made me sound like a really interesting person. I'm like, wow, that sounds like a great speech. And I'm like, crap, I'm the one giving it, so hope I don't disappoint. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about myself before I begin. My name is Robyn Urback. I work for the National Post. I am a columnist there, and I am also on the editorial board. And I have been there for about 2 years. Prior to that, I worked at Maclean's. I wrote a blog for Maclean's. It was mostly about campus issues, but I did sort of dabble in other issues as well. And at the same time, I also worked for Blog.to. And for those of you who don't know Blog.to, basically what that meant was if you gave me any intersection in Toronto, I could tell you where to get the best espresso, the best pizza, the best poutine within like a 2-block radius. It was a really great party trick, which I sort of lost when I moved to the National Post, but I like to think that I'm doing things that are a little bit more important now. So speaking of what I do now, as Denise mentioned, at the National Post, I don't really have a mandate per se. I sort of write a little bit about everything. So that includes Ontario politics, national politics, especially as we head into a federal election in the fall. That should be very exciting. And often a lot about social issues, and that includes, of course, women's issues and men's issues, and occasionally I'll step back and take a meta approach, which I'm doing today, obviously, and look at the way that the media actually covers men's issues and women's issues, and some of the problems that kind of come up when we tackle these issues in the mainstream media. So I want to start off by telling you about the single story actually that got me interested in the way that not just interested in gender issues, but what got me interested in the way that gender issues are covered in the media. And for those of you who know this story, I'm going to try and be sort of brief because I don't want to retell the whole thing. We'll be here all night. But this was a story dating back to 2012, and at the time there was an issue out of Simon Fraser University out in BC, and there was a discussion of whether to create a men's center there. So at the time there was a women's center there, as there is at most, if not all, I'm not sure, Canadian university campuses. They do have women's centers. Here, for the first time, they were talking about creating a men's center, and the women's center had been around since the 70s, I think it was 74 or something like that. And this one student, I believe he was a 5th-year student, and he was on the student council, and he said, I think it's about time that we create a men's center. Rightfully so, we know. I'm sure I don't have to tell a lot of people here that in terms of some of the mental health issues facing men, men commit suicide at a rate of 4 times that of women, and we know that those university years especially are really precarious. You have young men, sometimes boys, who aren't even adults, away from home for the first time. They're struggling academically, they're struggling trying to survive away from their parents, they're dealing with drugs and alcohol and hazing and all sorts of different issues, and it can be a really, really tough time. So basically this one student's argument was, hey, it's often hard for a young man to, I guess, swallow his pride to walk into a mental health center. There are these barriers that face men. You have to put up this bravado sort of attitude, and it's very vulnerable to walk into a center and say, look, I need some help. And a lot of campuses have those dedicated spaces for women, and he basically said, let's have one for men. So surprisingly, I would say, because I've done a lot of coverage of student councils, and they don't usually come up with the best solutions, but this student council actually approved it. So they allocated $30,000 to create a men's center on campus, which was exactly the equivalent of the funds that were allocated to the women's center on campus. So this seemed like a great thing, we're gonna have a women's center, a men's center, great. Naturally, this was a university campus, of course, so there was controversy. And what happened, there were protests and there were letters to the editor. And the Women's Center on campus actually put a statement on its website, and it essentially said, I'm paraphrasing, but it said, the rest of the campus is the men's center, so we don't need a dedicated men's center on campus, which is something you hear all the time. So that was going on, and that was kind of predictable, but what really caught my attention, and I think a lot of attention of other people who were following the story, was this one YouTube video. And this YouTube video was being sent around. I think it was sent out by the Women's Center, but it was sent around on Facebook, on Twitter, on forums, everyone was sort of linking to it, and it was a bunch of students basically airing their objections to this center. And it started off fairly innocuously. There were a few people saying, you know, I think the funds, $30,000 is a lot of money. We can allocate that money to something more deserving on campus, which I wouldn't agree with, but I mean, it's an argument. But then there were other people who went a little bit more hyperbolic with their objections. And I'm quoting here, one person said he didn't think it was responsible to have to have a center with a room with a PS3 and a bunch of douchebags playing games. Someone else said it will be a place to celebrate hegemonic masculinity, and so forth. So there were these ideas that were going around in this video that were frankly just offensive and ignorant and completely blind to the very real issues that face men, just by virtue of the fact that men are also humans with emotions and problems. What I found interesting, and what this all has to do with the media, is that when the media covered this story, and you can dig up some of the media reports back from 2012, I think, it was picked up by CBC and the Toronto Star and mainstream media. Often these things sort of stick within the campus, but this went beyond. The headline that we kept seeing, and I kept seeing, was that the idea of a men's center at Simon Fraser University creates controversy, which first of all is a headline I hate because it's way overused and it doesn't tell you anything about what's actually going on. We see it all the time. X creates controversy. It's the worst headline ever. But it also, in a way, and reading these articles too, they gave equal credence to both sides of the argument. So most of the time, the person quoted in favor of the center on campus was that one individual student who put forward the proposal at the beginning, and he was sort of explaining, you know, why we need this center, why it might be good for the young men on campus, and then we were hearing these hyperbolic opinions on the other side saying, you know, it'll just be a place for men to oppress women and to talk about how great it is to be in positions of power. And reading those things, I mean, one would logically make the argument that all opinions are not equal, and I don't think both sides should be given equal airing in mainstream media when one is frankly just ignorant and offensive. And I hate to draw this analogy because it's an easy one, and we do it all the time, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's an easy one. But if we were to imagine that the situation was reversed, and we were talking about creating a women's center on a university campus, and a bunch of men and women got together and made a YouTube video and said, you know, I really don't think that we should create this women's center because all they're going to do is talk about knitting in their periods. That would be the story. I can't imagine we would ever see a headline that would say, you know, women's center creates controversy. The headline, of course, would be a bunch of bigoted, misogynistic people have made this YouTube video in opposition of a women's center on campus. So that's my sort of long, drawn-out way of saying what got me interested in the issue of the way gender is presented in the media. And another issue that I want to point to, and I know that there is another speaker who is coming in a month or two's time who's going to be talking about Aboriginal issues, but I think it's important to bring up now just because it's very topical. We're talking about it a lot in the media just because we keep getting these updated reports. And that's something that honestly I talk about with my colleagues on the editorial board all the time. We constantly sort of struggle with this issue of, okay, we want to talk about the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal men, but it's such a, I don't want to call it a taboo, but it's a very hard thing to emphasize even in the National Post, which you would typically think is more of a right-leaning paper. It's something we struggle with, and we sort of say to ourselves, okay, how do we say this? And we want to make this point, but we want to get the least blowback as possible, which is something that we often say to ourselves over and over again. But to talk about this issue very briefly, because I know you're going to have a speaker talking about it more in depth, we know, frankly, that Aboriginal men are missing and murdered and go missing and murdered far more often than women. The RCMP released a report a couple of years ago saying between 1980 and 2012, I believe it was 1,017 Aboriginal women had been murdered, but they didn't release any statistics about Aboriginal men. And that's part of the problem as well, is that we don't even have sort of a single source of information on those statistics. A lot of the time when we refer to those statistics, it's a mishmash of different sources. And that's part of the problem, but when you do put it together, you realize that it's about twice as often. So if we're talking about between that time period, about 1,000 murdered Aboriginal women, probably it's about 2,000 murdered Aboriginal men. The reason why this is so relevant now is because earlier this month, the RCMP confirmed that about 70% of Aboriginal women who are killed by Aboriginal men. Likewise, Aboriginal men who are killed are also killed by Aboriginal men. And there's a whole topic of domestic abuse, which I think is a discussion for another time. But the point here is that when that statistic came out, the first thing I noticed was the Toronto Star, again, sorry, I like to beat on them a little bit, but the Toronto Star treated this as if this was sort of like a breakthrough revolution, like, oh my God, who would have known that this was actually happening? Was the RCMP keeping this information from us? Like, where did this come from? When the fact is, this isn't new information. We've known about this forever. The issue is not a gender issue. The issue is an issue of poverty and joblessness and homelessness and substance abuse and structural barriers and broken families, which affect both men and women. The problem is often in the media, we hear about missing and murdered Aboriginal women and we hear nothing about men. And no paper is immune. I will cite an example from my own paper, which is a feature that we put out about a month or two ago, and it was called Silent No More. Basically what it was is a reporter and one of our media people, I'm not sure what they call themselves, they wouldn't like me to say that, but what they did is they went to an Aboriginal community and they gave a number of teenage girls, Aboriginal teenage girls, video cameras. So the idea was that they would have these video cameras and they would document their lives and they would show people what their lives were like facing these daunting statistics in these communities that are known to be so broken and so troubled. And it was a really interesting feature, and I would actually encourage you to check it out because it's quite intriguing to see. Although me sitting in the comment section with my colleagues, we couldn't help thinking, well, what about the boys who are sharing the classrooms with those girls who are the exact same age, in the exact same communities? No one's even offering them a video camera to tell their stories. So that's just another example of, I mean, no paper is immune. We tend to see it more so from, I would say, left-leaning media organizations, but really we see it everywhere. And we also see it in government too, and government and media have this very complicated relationship where they put something out and we cover the hell out of it, and that's how things go. A recent example is the Ontario government coming out with its big campaign against domestic violence. And as a cafe has done a really good job of pointing out the fact that none of this campaign, you can watch the YouTube videos and all of the roundtable discussions and the hashtags, it doesn't mention men at all. And it's something that's been neglected in the media as well, because we see this, and I speak generally, but the media sees this new campaign and we think, oh great, the Ontario government is doing something on domestic violence, this is fantastic, we're going to eat it up and report it, and this is going to be fantastic. And it's unfortunate that infrequently does it actually catch on that, wait a minute, we're only talking about part of the population when really domestic violence affects both men and women. Anyway, so I've talked a lot about the problems. I want to sort of switch to a more optimistic note because although there are numerous examples that I could cite, and I think we would be here all night, and it's basically what frustrates me every single day, flipping through the paper, seeing the way that these things are presented, I think there are optimistic signs in terms of how things are changing, and I think there are two different aspects, two different forms of evidence of that. And I think the first is that we're seeing more mainstream coverage of issues that affect men. And by mainstream, I don't mean Christy Blatchford covering the Rehtaeh Parsons case, and I don't mean Barbara Kay talking about the way divorce affects men and custody battles, which are great, and I'm glad that they do that. The problem is a lot of people tend to zone that out, especially when it comes to Barbara Kay, who I think is a great writer and a great person. But a lot of the times when she, for example, writes about these issues, people dismiss it automatically because of the source. But we're seeing that changing a little bit. I sort of slagged on my paper a second ago, so now I'm going to champion it a little bit. So just last week, or this week actually, we did a story, our health reporter did a story, and it was just a flat-out news report about the difficulties that men face after they've suffered with cancer. So basically the idea was that men who have suffered cancer and are seeking some sort of penile reconstructive surgery often face barriers in terms of finances. So whereas women who have suffered with breast cancer and have had mastectomies and need reconstructive surgery, that's usually covered, and you can usually get that done very quickly. For men, it's absolutely not the same. It can be a long time, and it can be a lot of money out of pocket, and it was just encouraging to see something like that come out as just a mainstream news story. Another example, I think the Washington Post had a good story a week or two maybe ago about how schools are failing young boys, and we're seeing that more and more about how boys are struggling in schools now compared to girls, and we're talking a lot more about what we can do to help boys achieve academic success. And I think we're also seeing spokespeople that we wouldn't typically think of advocates, so to speak, of men's issues. Theo Fleury is a good example. He's been talking for years about the issue of sexual assault and how that affects young men. Of course, he's written a book on his experience dealing with that, and he's a really good advocate in the community in that he's sort of champion for being a hockey player, but he's also a very well-spoken guy with some really good quality things to say, and people take him seriously. The other example is Barry Sanders of the Detroit Lions. I don't know if anyone saw this, but it was maybe a couple weeks ago or longer. He wrote a blog post that was circulated widely, and it was about his experience with divorce, and it was all about outdated custody laws. So he was sort of talking about the struggles that he's faced personally trying to get access to his children and dealing with his ex-wife in the framework of these outdated custody laws. And it was just good to see someone, outside of what you would think of like the men's rights community talking about this issue that affects so many men. So that's one positive. The other optimistic sign that I'm going to point to is kind of a breach of the unspoken journalistic rule, which is never to read the comments. Because usually when you read the comments, the first person is calling you a Nazi, and the second person is calling the first person a fascist for calling you a Nazi. It's really interesting. If you go through them, that's usually what you see. But I have, for some reason, made a habit of reading the comments, especially when they deal with gender issues. And I have found overwhelmingly, for some reason, and maybe this is my bias speaking, or I don't know what it is, but I find a lot of really logical, progressive, well thought out responses in these comment sections. So we're talking about on Facebook, on Twitter, and just on the comment sections of newspapers talking about these gender issues. I tend to find that the comments often are leagues ahead of the media itself, which is really good to see, I would think, and it's something I think the media itself can actually learn from. I think we should take a note and see what our readers are saying about some of the things that we're putting out, because often readers will point out those biases and say, hey, wait a minute, look what you're doing here, this isn't fair. Imagine the inverse, what would you be saying about that? So it's something that I do quite consistently, and I think, someone might say it's naive to look at a comment section and think it's representative of the larger society, but I'm going to choose to look at it that way because it makes me feel good about what's going on. So there definitely still are problems in terms of the way the media covers gender issues, but I will say I think things are changing very, very slowly, and I think the important thing is to keep talking about them, to keep finding more people to talk about them outside certain communities. branching out to various people to get that message out there, and just to keep calling out the media when it's showing its bias, because eventually it sinks in and I think those changes happen.